All right, does that look okay?
Yep. Yeah, you're in presentation
Okay,
mode.
presentation mode, but I skipped the first slide. Anyway, you all know this stuff. So I'm going to be talking about riparian forests along creeks in the Sacramento area. Um, so to give you an overview of where this talk is going, I will start by talking about riparian forests in general and highlighting some of the key riparian species found in the Sacramento Valley. And I'll then share some of the research that I did as a graduate student, which focused on riparian zones along smaller creeks in the Sacramento metropolitan area. So caveat that everything I'm talking about today is focused on these smaller creeks up to about the size of Putah Creek, and not larger rivers like the American or Sacramento. So I'll talk about how the amount of riparian canopy has changed with urbanization and how hydrology is often altered in cities, and specifically how changes in stream flow can play out a little differently in a Mediterranean climate than in some other parts of the world. And then how these changes can influence the woody species along our creeks. And finally, I'll talk about the cool opportunities that we have for urban riparian zones. So what are riparian forests? I'm going to define them as areas of woody and herbaceous vegetation that border creeks and rivers. And for this talk, again, I'll be focusing on woody vegetation, so trees and shrubs, and again, on those smaller creeks. So riparian forests provide a lot of important ecosystem services or benefits to us. And because they form a boundary between the land and the water, riparian zones can have a large impact on water quality. And riparian vegetation can also help to stabilize stream banks. Riparian vegetation provides shade to streams and thus temperature regulation, which is particularly important for a lot of fish like salmon that like cold water. Riparian vegetation also generates organic matter, a lot of leaves that can fall and enter the stream, and that provides an important food source for aquatic communities. And riparian trees can also fall into streams or drop large branches, so that creates what we call large woody debris, and that provides a lot of habitat complexity in the stream. So not only do riparian forests influence habitat in the stream, but they also provide important habitat for many terrestrial and semi-terrestrial animals. And in California, riparian forests are particularly important habitat because they're so distinct in structure from the surrounding landscape. And this is especially true along some of the larger creeks and rivers that have stream flow year round, because the summer water supply allows dense tree cover in areas where the uplands are more open woodlands and grasslands. And so although riparian zones have this important source of water for plants, they can otherwise be pretty stressful places for plants to live. And riparian plants have developed a number of adaptations to help them survive flooding and saturated soils. A lot of riparian plants have flexible stems so that they can bend in floodwaters without breaking. And many also make use of the water for reproduction. So hydrochory is a term for dispersing seeds or propagules by water. And many riparian plants have seeds that are adapted for water transport, or they may also be able to sprout from pieces that may have broken off in a flood and been transported downstream. And willows are particularly adept at this. And riparian species can also develop adventitious roots. So these are roots that are generated from non-root parts of the plant. And so if a tree gets buried by sediments in a flood, it can potentially sprout new roots from its trunk that are buried, that are much closer to the surface of the soil, that new surface. And then finally, roots need oxygen, and saturated soils are typically very low in oxygen. So some wetland plants have developed structures in their tissues called parenchyma, and these are essentially pipes, sort of shown in this lower right picture, that allow oxygen to travel down into the roots of the plant. So who are our major players in riparian zones here? Again, since my research focused on woody species, I've pulled out trees and shrubs. So obligate riparian or wetland species are those that are always found in riparian zones or in wetlands, and they like to have their feet wet. They don't survive very well without access to shallow groundwater. And our common obligate riparian species in the Sacramento area are all natives. They're willows, and we have many species of those. buttonbush, white alder, and Fremont cottonwood. And there's also a number of native species that are often associated with riparian zones in the Sacramento Valley, but may be found in other habitats too, or they may be found farther up the stream banks or along intermittent streams that dry up in the summer. So they tend to have a greater tolerance for water limitation, and they may not tolerate frequent inundation as well as the obligate riparian species. And I've sort of arranged these common riparian associated species loosely from left to right in terms of how strongly they're associated with wetlands in our area. So the two species to the left of the dashed line, Oregon ash and box elder, are found most often in wetland or riparian contexts. And this distinction will come up later in some of the research I'll share. These two species can be grouped with the obligate riparian species as indicators of wetland habitat. And then on the right-hand side of the line, California sycamore is often found a little farther out in the floodplains of larger rivers, and mule fat is very commonly found along streams, but it's also more drought tolerant. And then finally, black elderberry and the subspecies blue elderberry are really common in the drier parts of riparian corridors. And then along, so valley oaks are one of the hallmark trees of the upper floodplains of larger rivers, and they can also occur along streams, but they're also very well adapted to the dry summers here, and they're often found in woodlands that are far from surface water. But all of these plant species I've talked about are ones that you may have encountered at the Putah Creek Council Native Plant Nursery or planting events. So let's talk about cities. Urbanization does cause changes to streams and the riparian zones that border them. And the most common way people tend to think of this type of change is the physical disturbance that riparian zones experience if they're cleared for infrastructure like bridges. However, urbanization can also affect riparian zones by changing hydrology or the way that water moves around the landscape. And the way that riparian land is managed and used is typically different in cities than other contexts. And finally, we also introduce new species to the area through our landscaping efforts. And we'll be exploring all these different types of change in the rest of the talk. I want to start by thinking about changes in the amount of riparian tree canopy along streams with urbanization. So a lot of urban ecological research has been done in naturally forested areas where we often see a decrease in riparian tree canopy after urbanization. And this effect is often just assumed to be the case, that there will be less riparian tree canopy after urbanization. And it makes a lot of sense. If you start with a forest and you put a city there, you stand to lose the forest. But in areas where dense forest isn't the natural vegetation type, or where there are legacies of other land uses, we may actually see a different outcome. And urbanization in this case can actually cause a number of changes that might increase riparian forests. So I looked at riparian tree canopy change in the Arcade Creek watershed, which is shown in blue on this map. It's about 85 square kilometers, and it's located to the northeast of the city of Sacramento, which is shown in gray on the map. It's mostly located in the city of Citrus Heights. So I used aerial imagery of the watershed from 1937 and 2014 to map and measure changes in both land use and tree canopy cover. And during this time, the watershed transitioned from being almost entirely agricultural to almost entirely urban. And what I found was that urbanization was accompanied by a pretty dramatic increase in riparian tree canopy. The average tree canopy width nearly doubled, so the riparian forests are getting wider. And the density of trees along small streams increased as well. So these two photographs of the same stream segment from the two different time periods really illustrate those changes. So you'll notice a much thicker band of trees along the stream in 2014. And while there are lots of gaps in the tree canopy in 1931, the tree cover along the stream is basically continuous in 2014. And if you want to nerd out on some maps and graphs and the actual data from this study, you can check out the paper we wrote on this project. Feel free to email me if you're interested in that. So why do we see these changes? Well, there's probably a number of contributing factors, but we found that the most important one was probably the change in land management. So urbanization alters the management of riparian vegetation and the pressures that it faces. So before urbanization, the Sacramento region was heavily impacted by agriculture. Cattle grazing can inhibit the regeneration of riparian trees, and trees were also cut for wood and to make way for crops. After urbanization, these pressures disappear, and instead, many riparian areas are public lands that may be used for recreational activities. And the vegetation right along streams may be relatively unmanaged. We also plant trees in parks and yards that border streams, and we tend to keep our buildings a little farther away from streams to avoid flooding. So in areas that have already lost a lot of their riparian forests to land uses like agriculture or mining, urbanization can actually be an opportunity for some of that riparian vegetation to come back or even exceed historical levels. But then we have to ask, are these riparian forests comparable to what was lost and what's actually growing in them? So urbanization also changes the way that water moves around the landscape, and this can have a large impact on the vegetation along streams. And one widespread effect of urban development and the consequent altered hydrology is stream channel incision, or downcutting. And I'll explain the process by which this often happens in cities. So before development, we have our nice happy stream over here, and precipitation falling across the watershed would largely soak into the soil and make its way to our stream or to deeper groundwater relatively slowly. But then after we cover much of the landscape with impervious surfaces like buildings and roadways, rainwater runs off the landscape quickly and is often conveyed directly to streams via stormwater infrastructure. So the rain that falls on your roof may travel down your gutter into a drain and flow through a pipe that empties directly into the stream. So this causes an increase in the volume of water entering the stream all at once. And that can scour out the stream channel and cause it to downcut or incise. So we end up with these much deeper channels that often end up becoming wider too. And I wanted to mention that increased impervious surfaces and this consequent increased storm flow is a very common cause of channel incision in urban areas, but it's not the only thing that can cause channel incision. And in the lower Putah Creek watershed, the extensive incision and channel widening has more to do with changes in stream flow associated with the Monticello Dam. And I'd be happy to talk more about that later if anyone's interested. So in many temperate climate regions like the Northeast, which receive precipitation year-round, water tables are close to the land surface in riparian zones, and shallow groundwater flows towards the stream through the riparian zone. And channel incision causes this decline in water table levels, which leaves riparian vegetation and soils high and dry. So this has led to a generalized theory that urban riparian zones tend to be drier than non-urban riparian zones. And that can cause our typical riparian or wetland associated tree species that are usually found along streams to be replaced by upland associated species. But in Mediterranean climate regions like the Sacramento Valley, almost all of our rain falls during the cool winter months. So small streams in these regions tend to be intermittent, and they often dry out completely during the hot summer months. This is kind of an extreme example in Deer Creek Hills. And so in Mediterranean climate regions, water tables may look like those in a temperate climate during the wet season, depending on the underlying geology. But in the dry season, water tables tend to be below the level of the stream bed in a lot of places, and sometimes pretty far below it. And that means that riparian zones experience these dry conditions every summer, regardless of whether the channel is incised or not. And another change we see in Mediterranean climates is that urbanization can dramatically increase water availability and runoff in the dry summer months due to landscape irrigation and also activities like car and sidewalk washing. So this runoff, which is affectionately known as urban drool, can flow directly into streams through stormwater infrastructure, and that can actually create perennial flows in formerly intermittent streams. And some urban streams also receive effluent from wastewater treatment plants, which can provide a larger and more consistent dry season stream flow. So now in the dry season, these streams can be flowing, but they're also typically losing water. So we'd expect that this could create wetter conditions in the riparian zone where water is seeping into the bank soils. However, where the streams are deeply incised, this water might be below the primary rooting zone of riparian trees, so it might not actually have that much of an influence on them. So to recap, we have these two contrasting effects of urbanization in the Mediterranean climate. We still have channel incision, which can create drier conditions in the riparian zone by lowering water tables and also sometimes preventing overbank flooding in the wet season. And then we have increased dry season flow, which potentially increases moisture in the riparian zone seasonally, but during the hottest months of the growing season. And what's really cool from a research perspective is that Sacramento has all of these different stream conditions within an urban context due to different types of water management and different underlying geology. So there are some areas where the streams are not incised and some areas where they are incised. And within both of those conditions, some streams have flow in the dry season and some don't. So it's really a gradient of channel incision, but we can kind of think of these four different scenarios where we have unincised with no flow, unincised with flow, incised with no flow, and incised with flow. And this very summer stream flow is created largely because many of the streams are fed by highly localized water inputs, like the stormwater outfall in this photo. So since these streams tend to lose water in the dry season, upstream flow doesn't necessarily predict downstream flow. Sometimes there will be a stretch of stream that's consistently supplied with water from an outfall, but 100 meters downstream, the water disappears and the stream bed is totally dry. So I did some research to see what effects these different conditions might have on the species composition of riparian forests and also riparian tree water stress. So I sampled woody vegetation and stream channel characteristics at all of the 66 locations shown on this map. And these were all publicly accessible and not highly maintained. So each location is shaded to show whether it had summer stream flow or not. The flowing sites are in black and the dry sites are in white. And then due to those highly localized water inputs, I actually had a number of sites where part of the stream reach that I sampled was dry and part of it had stream flow. So those sites are shown in gray. And at some of these sites, I also measured the water stress of trees growing along the banks. And what I found was that channel incision had a very strong effect on riparian species composition, and more so than dry season stream flow. So first, our native wetland associated trees were much more common along streams that were not incised. And again, these are those native wetland associated species that really depend on shallow groundwater and the ones that we defined as wetland species for the analysis. So we've got our willow, buttonbush, white alder, Fremont cottonwood, box elder, and then Oregon ash is technically classified in this group, but it was certainly found along drier streams as well. Unfortunately, we also found more non-native trees along streams that were not incised. So the most common non-native species we found were cultivated ornamental species like these ones here. So we have privet, silk tree, and Chinese tallow tree. And these are all species that can escape from landscaped areas and populate unmanaged stream banks. Privet in particular is a very, very popular bird food. So birds love to eat the berries and then they come to the riparian zone and poop them out. There's just tons and tons of privet along these streams. But since none of these species were originally from arid or Mediterranean climates, they typically require supplemental water to survive here. So it's not surprising that they would also be found along streams where they can more easily access water. However, on our highly incised streams, we found more native oak trees, including valley oaks, interior live oaks, and blue oaks. We actually found quite a number of blue oaks, which I was pretty excited about. So these species can all form deep tap roots to access lower water tables. So it's not surprising that they were more common along these highly incised streams. So we didn't find that dry season flow predicted the presence of different types of fully grown trees, but we did find that it appeared to affect seedlings pretty dramatically. We actually didn't find any seedlings of those wetland associated species along dry streams. They were only found along flowing streams. And in contrast, we found oak seedlings almost everywhere. So this suggests that dry season flow might actually be very important for the establishment of wetland associated species. And we did our sampling during the major drought in 2014. So it's likely that some of these streams that really rely on, well, whose flow is dependent on whether people are overwatering their yards or washing their cars, and that excess water is going down the drains. It's possible, and in fact, perhaps likely, that they had water in previous years. So most of the streams that I sampled were too small to have records of stream flow in the past, but there is a USGS gauge on Arcade Creek. And that does show that it used to have substantially more dry season flow than it does today. So some of those urban water conservation messages are getting out there and changing our stream flows. But at any rate, it seems quite possible that these wetland trees need summer water to get established, but then they can persist under drier conditions. We also found that dry season stream flow alleviated tree water stress, but only when streams were not incised. So for both of the species we looked at, valley oaks and Oregon ash, we found that the trees were much less stressed along flowing streams that were not incised, but there wasn't much difference in water stress among all of the other scenarios. So stream flow didn't have much of an effect when streams were incised, and incision didn't have much of an effect when streams were dry. So it's likely that increased access to water along these unincised streams that have dry season flow could lead to increased growth rates for riparian trees. And of course, we necessarily had to study species that were found in all of these different conditions. But for some of our more obligate wetland species, the stress might just be too great along streams in these other conditions to allow them to persist there. I was realizing that this talk is going to be a little bit shorter than I thought it was going to be. I was really worried I was going to go over time. So we have plenty of time for discussion. What can we conclude about our urban riparian zones? I think they have a lot to offer. The Sacramento Valley has lost over 90% of its original riparian zones. So I think urban areas offer a particularly important opportunity for restoration in this area. In many cities, riparian zones are the largest areas of relatively unmanaged forest vegetation. So they're really critically important for both people and wildlife. And in this aerial photo, for example, it's really easy to see where the streams are because of their tree canopy. And urban riparian zones may not look exactly like their historical counterparts, but they can still provide important ecosystem services. And we've seen that in at least some areas around Sacramento, urbanization has actually increased the amount of riparian forests along smaller streams, and we can target those areas for management based on their hydrologic conditions. So ideally, we would love to avoid stream channel incision entirely, but where streams are already incised, we can focus on fostering native oak trees along their banks. So we saw evidence of really robust native oak regeneration in the relatively unmanaged areas where we sampled, and oaks were prominent in all the different size classes that we measured. So it's possible that urban riparian forests could help to ameliorate the decline in California's native oak populations. We can also prioritize water conservation measures in areas where increased dry season stream flow is not going to do much for the riparian vegetation. So where these streams are already incised, that summer flow is not going to do much to support our native riparian species. And maybe we can really try to double down on water conservation in those areas. But another cool thing that's possible in incised channels is that when they've also widened, we can actually do restoration within the stream channel to create a new narrower stream channel in a riparian area along it that's all within the old channel. So this is what Putah Creek Council has worked on in winters, if you've had a chance to visit that section of the creek in the past few years. Where stream channels are not incised, we can take advantage of some of the increased stream flow in urban areas to foster our native riparian species. And I think this is a really cool possibility because we've lost these species from so many areas. And even if they maybe didn't used to be prevalent along the intermittent creeks that used to be in these areas, if those creeks are now perennial and we can foster them there, I think that's a really cool opportunity. However, this might require more targeted management of non-native species that also appreciate that extra water. So I wanted to end by highlighting a nice example of an urban riparian restoration project led by Putah Creek Council in Davis. It's officially called the North Davis Riparian Greenbelt now, but everyone calls it the North Davis Ditch. So this is a stormwater conveyance channel that runs along the north side of town between the city and the agricultural fields. So you can kind of see that on the right-hand side. I have this image from Google Earth showing the edge of Davis next to these agricultural fields. So this stormwater channel receives water runoff from both areas. And Putah Creek Council helped to plant a lot of native riparian species along this channel, like the cottonwoods in this photo. And now it's a really lovely place to walk or run or ride your bike. And I think it's just a really cool example of what can be done with, this probably wasn't following exactly the course of any historical stream channel, but it's a stream now, and we can do some cool restoration along it. So with that, I would like to thank all the very, very many people who made this research possible, and especially my advisor, Mary Catanasso. And thank you so much for coming, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
Great, awesome. All right, I'll check our questions. If anyone has any questions, be sure to enter them in the chat. We do have one in there, so we'll just dive right in. Turret asks, did the streams that you studied all have the same geology, the same kinds of strata?
That's a really good question, and no, and I will say I'm not a geologist. What I can say is that towards sort of the more Sacramento side of my study area, the water tables tend to be a lot deeper, but there's really patchy areas of hard pan. So in some areas, streams will just incise to a hard pan layer, but in some areas, they can downcut a lot farther where that hard pan layer doesn't really exist. And that certainly changes the way that that this dry season flow can interact with the riparian vegetation as well. In some of the eastern part of my study area, the bedrock is actually a fair bit shallower. And in that area, we saw a lot of places where it's pretty clear that the urban water inputs are actually creating sustained high water tables throughout the dry season, which is, I don't know. I like to look at the positive and think about like the cool plants that can grow there now, but it's certainly not quite what it used to be.
Great. I had a question, or maybe just something for you to maybe talk a little bit more about. Do you want to comment on the effects of Monticello Dam on some of the tributaries in the region?
Sure. You may actually, or actually, I'm sure other people on the Zoom know more about this than I do, honestly. But from my understanding, it's kind of an unusual situation in this watershed where storm flows. So there used to be very high floods along the creek. With the dam being put in, those flood levels were decreased. And that kind of meant that water coming in from tributaries wasn't kind of backing up to the same level. All of a sudden the flood was down here. And so the channels sort of down cut to meet the new flood levels. And then that propagated up those streams. And I'm sure many of you have experience in that part of the watershed. There's some really, really dramatic incision. Does that kind of fit with your understanding, Hallie, or anyone else who wants to chime in?
Yeah, no, that's kind of my understanding as well. And you can really see the effects of all of that sedimentation at Lake Solano Park, where the lake is a lot shallower than it should be, and it gives way to invasive species that wouldn't normally be thriving in our watershed. And so yeah, that's just something I've been noticing a lot more as I spend more time at Lake Solano Park, is all the different invasive species that are starting to sort of come in because of the shallow and the slow flows and all the sediment. So
I don't think this is quite as much a cause in Putah Creek watershed, but like dams also stop sediment from moving downstream, and so sediment starved waters can also cause channels to incise more. Yeah.
All right, we have a question from Elizabeth. She says, I just finished another webinar from California Native Plant Society, and they were talking about gardening in a drought. So lots of gray water usage. Now I'm thinking it might really depend on where your water runs off to before deciding if you should allow more runoff or not. What are your thoughts on that?
Good question. Well, it's always good to know where your water's going. I think a lot of us, especially, I don't know, I've moved around a lot and like I'm not always aware of where my drain is headed. I would say that especially if you're using gray water, that's fabulous. It's good to we need vegetation in urban areas too. It's really important for cooling urban areas and for keeping people healthy. So there's a really major trade-off between water conservation and trying to promote urban vegetation that keeps us kind of cool and happy. So if we do focus more on our drought tolerant native plants, they require a lot less water than turf. And there's also a question of, if you're irrigating carefully, you really shouldn't have much runoff, right? Like a lot of the runoff we get is from overhead irrigation that hits sidewalks and driveways and just flows directly into the stormwater system without even touching a plant first. But I think it's also kind of an interesting trade-off that we can see that some of the vegetation along our streams in this area really has developed in the context of this increased summer water resource. And if we were to just cut that off, it might actually have some negative consequences for those trees and other vegetation along those creeks. So it's an interesting trade-off. Then, of course, there's always the question of what is the quality of the water that's going into these streams. A lot of urban runoff is pretty enriched in nitrogen, which can act as a fertilizer for trees, but is also potentially not great for receiving waters. If there's too much of it, it can cause algal blooms and eventually hypoxia down the line. So yeah, there's a lot of management trade-offs.
All right. Let me pull up the next question. Dan asks, would you consider the Chickahominy Dry Slough in rural Davis to be an incised stream bed?
Oh my goodness. Well, this is gonna highlight some of my ignorance that I don't actually know where that is. Is it maybe could you give me a tip? I'm thinking like the only stream bed I can think of in Davis is the old the North Fork of Putah Creek that was cut off. And that certainly would fit the description of an incised stream in some parts, for sure. Although its water situation is weird enough. I'm not really 100% sure you'd call it a stream, but
yeah, I wish I could help. I don't know where that is either. Sorry. If somebody wants to pop in and give us more details in the chat, we can come back to that. But until then, we'll move on to Kate. Kate asks, in the riparian corridors that got increased arboreal cover post-urbanization, were the native volunteers, were they planted, or does that vary from area to area?
For the most part, they were not planted. For the most part, they showed up on their own. There's certainly some areas where people intentionally planting in parks and backyards has increased the canopy width a little bit, but by and large, it's just natural regeneration. And I should say that some of the increased density we saw is probably also due to those non-native species, the ornamentals. A lot of them are kind of smaller and shrubbier and tend to fill in the gaps and make it really dense. And we've also, lost a lot of the maintenance practices of the indigenous people here who would have, heavily managed these stream corridors to promote different plants. So yeah, lots of changes.
Great. And Craig says, nice talk. Thank you. You showed how canopy size sometimes increased with urbanization. Any thoughts on the potential extent of the riparian canopy at these same locations prior to European agriculture?
Oh yeah. So this was my master's project, and I spent so long trying to get a good sense of what these areas might have looked like before European settlement. And there's just not a lot of good data, unfortunately. There's certainly some anecdotal evidence that there used to be a lot more willows along some of these streams, so we could intuit that they might have had fairly dense vegetation. Arcade Creek is named that ostensibly because of the large trees creating an arcade feeling over the creek, so we could perhaps assume that there were in fact large trees lining that creek. My guess is that it probably depended quite a bit on the stream size and prior hydrology, which is also kind of really hard to assess. Some of these streams might have been intermittent in some years and actually perennial in other years, allowing more riparian associated species to get established. So yeah, it's a really great question. I wish I had more information for you.
Okay, great. And next question, Jocelyn asks, do you think these more perennial flows could be redirected to recreate marshes that existed before streams were more channelized?
That's a really good question. I think in some areas, yes. And as I sort of mentioned in some of the eastern parts of the study area, like in Folsom, really, there are some areas that have become pretty marshy. There's a lot of kind of chained retention ponds and then some stream with kind of marshy areas around it. But in a lot of places, there's just not that much space along the channels, especially places that were developed earlier. a lot of the development tends to go a little bit closer to the stream channel. And then also in areas where the stream channel is pretty heavily incised, the water tables would be too low to support the marsh vegetation. But yeah, definitely. I think in some places we're even seeing that without any intentional interventions.
Cool. And then back to the dry slough, it runs from Berryessa Mountains to Yolo Bypass. And Dan says that he's near the Yolo County Airport, if that gives any reference to where we are.
Oh, I don't actually think I'm familiar with that area. I'm really sorry.
No worries. I think Craig Thompson commented that it is highly incised.
Okay.
So someone answered our question. And it looks like I skipped over Nikki's question. She asks, what role do you think the construction of levees at the Yolo Bypass played in changing historic distribution of riparian natives in areas such as Davis?
Ooh, that's a great question. And again, there's probably some people on this call who could answer that better than I could. But you know, whenever you change where the water is, you're going to change where the species that need that water go. So yeah, I know there's some work being done right now. Folks trying to understand the historical vegetation along Putah Creek, and hopefully they will give a CreekSpeak maybe next year, and we can all learn more about that.
That is a great question. It's something I think about pretty often. So yeah. All right. Well, if we have any other last minute questions, you can pop those in the chat really quickly and we'll just see. Doesn't seem like it though. So I think with that, we can end the talk. Thank you so much, Joanna, for donating your time and volunteering to give this talk and sharing some of your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And again, if you have questions or want to look at any of the papers, please feel free to shoot me an email.
We do have one last minute question, sorry. Matt asks, he says he grew up on Chicken Ranch Slough in Sacramento. Are you familiar with it? And would you know why it seemed to become more stagnant?
Ooh, okay. I am familiar with Chicken Ranch Slough a little bit. I didn't actually study it because it was a little too altered. I was looking at streams that didn't have, that weren't armored. So we're still kind of in their natural channel. So I don't have any great insights about the hydrology in that part of the city. Sorry.
All right. Well, I think that's it for questions. So thank you so much, Joanna. Thanks for everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed tonight's CreekSpeak, and we have another one coming up in just a couple of weeks that's going to be talking about some of the changes that are happening at the City of Davis South Fork Reserve, some accessibility changes and good stuff that's happening there. So join us for that if you're interested, and you can sign up for that on our website. But other than that, thanks for coming, and everyone have a good night. And I hope to see you again at another CreekSpeak.
Thanks so much.